Most of us, when we think of the Bible, we think of it as, a sacred, divine text. But what if its origins were actually deeply, strategically political? Today we're going to dig into a really fascinating academic view, one that sees the Old Testament not just as a book that was revealed, but one that was carefully assembled in the face of one disaster after another.
All right, so let's just dive right in with this big, kind of provocative question. What if the Old Testament wasn't just handed down from on high, but was actually put together like a survival guide? This theory we're exploring suggests this was a very deliberate, politically driven project, specifically designed to hold a people together when their entire world was literally falling apart.
Right, and that's the core idea here. The Bible wasn't written in some peaceful, quiet library. It was forged in the fire of crisis. Think of it as a dynamic response put together over centuries to events that threatened to wipe the ancient Israelites right off the map. So our journey is going to take us through three major historical periods. Each one acted like a crucible, a pressure cooker, that forced scribes and priests to write, to edit, and to compile the stories that would eventually become their sacred text. Okay, so this is really the key takeaway, the main point. This wasn't just a religious project. It was a brilliant political strategy. The whole goal was to forge a single, unified national identity out of total chaos, to create a foundation so strong it could survive even the complete loss of a homeland. All right, let's jump into our first major crisis. We're going to see how this existential threat really sparked the initial drive to gather all these ancient stories into one single, powerful narrative. So, try to imagine the chaos here. It's 722 BCE. The northern kingdom of Israel is just obliterated by the Assyrian war machine. A huge wave of refugees floods into the smaller southern kingdom of Judah. We're talking about the population of Jerusalem practically doubling overnight. This creates a massive, massive political problem. How on earth do you unite these two very distinct groups of people?
Well, the solution, according to this theory, was literary. It was brilliant. Scribes started weaving together the unique traditions from both kingdoms. They took the North's most cherished story, the Exodus, their foundational myth, and they merged it with the South sagas of the patriarch Abraham. And what's the result? A brand new, shared history for a newly unified people, all living under a single Judean king. Pretty smart, right?
Now hang on, because the story takes this really fascinating turn. About a century later, Assyrian power is starting to fade. The Judean king Josiah kicks off this major religious reform. And then, what a coincidence, his high priest just happens to discover an ancient scroll in the temple.
Okay, now look at the structure here. This is wild. This found text, which scholars identify as the core of Deuteronomy, has a very, very specific format. You've got a preamble, you've got stipulations or rules, witnesses, curses, and blessings. Now look at the Assyrian vassal treaty on the left. It's the exact same structure. This was the loyalty contract the Assyrian Empire forced its subjects to sign. So they essentially just copied the empire's legal template. And this just brilliantly illustrates the political genius of what they did. By copying the treaty format, but swapping out the Assyrian emperor and putting God in his place, the scribes were basically nullifying their oath to Assyria. It was a declaration of independence, but it was disguised as a religious text. It's an act of, as it says here, high treason and sophisticated political subversion.
But you know how these things go. This newfound independence, it wasn't going to last. The nation would soon face its greatest test yet, the complete and utter destruction of its capital and its temple, and the forced exile of its entire elite to Babylon.
I mean, can you imagine? This was the terrifying existential question facing the exiles. Their whole worldview was just shattered. If their God couldn't even protect his own holy city, did that mean the gods of Babylon were stronger? This crisis demanded a radical, brand new answer.
So to prevent a total collapse of faith, the editors and scribes in Babylon developed this incredibly powerful theological argument. It's known as a theodicy, and basically a theodicy is a way to defend God's goodness and justice when something absolutely terrible happens. They had to explain the catastrophe without making their God look weak.
And this was the pivot. This was the genius move. The destruction of the temple, it wasn't a sign of God's weakness. No, it was a sign of his immense power and his justice. He was punishing his own people for failing to follow the law. See how that reframes everything? Defeat is no longer defeat. It's actually a confirmation of God's absolute control and sovereignty.
And history was also getting a rewrite to serve a political purpose.
I mean, think about it. When the exiles finally get to return home, guess what? They find other people living on their ancestral lands. So the biblical writers start promoting this powerful idea that the land had been left completely empty, just waiting for them. It was a myth, but it was a politically useful one that basically delegitimized the land claims of anyone who had stayed behind.
Okay, so let's get into the final phase of this whole process. This is where the administrative needs of yet another foreign empire, this time Persia, forced the final compilation of the Torah, which is, the first 5 books of the Bible.
Right. So the Persian Empire was huge, and it was really well organized, and their policy was basically to let their provinces govern themselves using their own ancestral laws. But here's the problem for the Judeans. They had multiple competing legal traditions. So the Persians essentially came in and said, listen guys, figure it out, come up with one official rule book that we can enforce. We don't care which one, just make it one.
And this imperial pressure, it forced a compromise. These rival priestly and scribal schools, they had to merge their different legal texts. And this is so cool because we can still see the evidence of this merger today. The final Torah actually has contradictory laws, like completely different instructions for how to celebrate Passover, sitting right next to each other. The theory is that keeping both was the only political compromise that would get all the different factions to sign on.
Scholars have this fantastic name for these contradictions. They call them scars of unification. How great is that? They're not mistakes. They're like the fossilized evidence of these really difficult political negotiations that were required to create a single unified text and, keep the nation from falling into civil war.
And this is it. This is the ultimate triumph of this entire centuries-long strategy. With the physical temple gone and the people scattered all over the place, the text itself became the nation. It was a portable homeland, defined by a shared story and a shared law that could be carried literally anywhere.
So finally, let's just take a quick look at how, from this academic perspective, even the most famous foundational stories in the Bible served very specific and timely political functions for the generations that were putting them all together.
Let's break this down a bit. The Exodus story, it's this incredibly powerful anti-imperial myth. It's there to reassure a conquered people that their God can and will take down any superpower. What about the story of the swift conquest of Canaan? Well, that functions as a kind of divine green light for King Josiah's own plans for military expansion. And the Golden Age? This grand united monarchy under David and Solomon? That becomes this potent myth to legitimize the rule of later, much less glorious kings. See? Every story has a job to do.
So, to wrap up this secular viewpoint, the Hebrew Bible is seen not just as a religious document, but as this absolute masterpiece of political negotiation and national self-assertion. It's a textual constitution, one that was meticulously crafted to create and then preserve a nation against, frankly, impossible odds.
And this brings us to one last, kind of provocative thought to leave you with. If the greatest stories are forged in crisis, if they're tools for survival and for building identity, it kind of forces us to ask, right? In the face of our own modern challenges, what are the unifying stories that we are writing for ourselves right now?